my name is Morgan and I'm a neuroscience researcher, and I have always desperately wanted to be on one of those like interview things where they're like, hey neuroscientist, how does this thing work? I don't know. I just want people to ask me questions, I guess.
This is a dream that I have had since lunch, and I am not giving up on it now.
I mean, I did make a whole channel called Ask a Neuroscientist. And for a while, I've been thinking about doing one of those videos where they like start to Google a question and then answer whatever Google does, like the autocomplete interview, but like for neuroscientists. And then the other day I was scrolling through YouTube and what pops up but this video. And so I thought, you know what? Why do the work? Why can't I let Wired do the work and then I'll answer the questions? I'm also curious to see how this compares because in a lot of my videos, I say in the intro to all of my videos that I'm a neuroscience researcher, but many people have referred to me as Dr. Morgan or asked me neurosurgeon questions. So I'm curious to see how my answers as someone who researches the brain would compare to the answers of someone who does surgery on the brain. Again, to be clear, this is not me claiming to be a neurosurgeon. This is me wondering sort of what's the difference here as far as like our education about the brain. So we'll be watching this video together and I'm going to try to answer all of the questions before this person answers the questions, and I don't know. That's the premise of this video, is that I'm gonna watch this and I'm gonna try to answer the questions. Alrighty, let's get into it.
Dr. Brian Coppell, neurosurgeon.
Hi, Dr.
Today
Brian
I'll be
Coppell.
answering questions from Twitter. This is brain surgery support.
Brain surgery support. Okay, so not neuroscience support.
At Akenta Ifianil asks, what does the brain feel like to the touch?
I'm sorry for that maniacal laugh. If anyone has followed me on TikTok, I had a long fight with people about this because some influencer was telling people that one of their friends touched a brain and it turned into soup. Like, that the second that you die, your brain turns into mush, and so you actually can't hold the brain because it won't hold its shape. It was just all of this misinformation, and I was like, that's not how brains work. Like, yes, they are one of your first body parts to start decomposing, but that does not mean that they immediately turn into mush the second you die. Also, people were saying that the brain isn't like, it won't hold its shape because it's held in shape by the skull, which is also not true. So your brain forms its own structure, and it can stay together. I mean, it's not perfect. It's a lot of people compare it to Jell-O. I don't think that's the most accurate comparison. I would say it holds together like Jell-O, but feels more like jelly. And like if you squish it, it definitely turns into a jelly texture, like the jelly that you put on like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I'm sorry if I've ruined peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for you forever. But yeah, so if you squish it on purpose, it makes more of like a jelly-like texture. But otherwise, it's kind of similar to Jell-O. Yeah. It's also very slimy. Very, like, you can try to dry it off, but you're not really gonna have much success. Like, it's pretty slimy.
If tofu and Jell-O had a baby, that's how the brain feels. There's a give to it.
That's interesting because I've never had tofu. But I think he's saying similar to what I said, because he said like tofu and jelly, and I said like Jell-O and jelly. So I think we're on the same page.
As a patient breathes or the heart pumps blood, the brain pulsates accordingly. At Stony P asks, did you all know that you gotta be awake for brain surgery when you're operating?
These questions are so funny. So I'm not a neurosurgeon, but from what I know about neurosurgery, you don't have to be awake in every type of neurosurgery. I think it's just some types, and it's mostly if they want to make sure that they're getting a specific brain region that's like responsible for something, or that they're not hitting a brain region that's responsible for something. So like if they have to go through like the motor cortex, which is a part of your brain that's responsible for movement, and to get to a different thing, they might have you do some movements, and then they will know, oh, we've really messed something up, I guess, if you stop moving. That's my impression of neurosurgery. Let's see what the real answer is.
Training on areas especially related to language. We literally ask them questions. Some patients have played instruments to demonstrate that they are doing okay. I have had a patient play a guitar in my operating room. We want to see when we're trying to do a surgery for tremor, which is a rhythmic oscillation of the hands or the feet.
I love, so being a science communicator myself, I do a lot of things on like talks and workshops on how to do science communication. And one of the biggest things is like, don't use big words. And it's not necessarily to like dumb your language down, but more to make it more accessible to different people and like less intimidating. And so I love that he said tremors and then realized that what he was saying was maybe not great science communication and switched it up to rhythmic oscillations. If I walked up to I'm not attacking this dude, I promise. I'm sure he does great work. So far he's been cool. But if I walked up to you and said someone has a tremor versus if I walked up to you and said someone had rhythmic oscillations, which one makes more sense? Like, just leave it at a tremor.
Patient be able to drink from a cup or sign their name, which are things that they were not able to do. If you stimulate and the patient's still able to respond, they can repeat a question, they can repeat a phrase, that tells us that it's safe to go forward. Aren't they screaming in pain?
Yeah, so the reason why like it's actually not that huge of a deal to have someone awake during brain surgery is because your brain does not have any pain receptors. So your scalp and your actually I don't know if your bones in your skull do, but your scalp for sure has pain receptors, so they can give you like some lidocaine or like a local anesthetic to make you not in pain in that part. Surely they knock you out while they're drilling through your skull, because even though you wouldn't feel much pain there, I imagine that would cause a lot of emotional distress. I feel like the vibrations and stuff would just not be fun to go through. So I hope they like put you to sleep during that part and then wake you up for the other parts. Let's find out.
The answer is no. The brain in of itself has no pain receptors. At Blake and Ban asks, what is harder, rocket science or brain surgery?
Okay, this is something I've had many debates about, and I have many friends online and in person who are engineers, and I have friends who work at NASA, and people always think that the thing they don't do is harder. I've even had this conversation with medical doctors because I'm in the process of getting my PhD, because medical doctors think that getting your PhD is harder. People with PhDs think that becoming a medical doctor is harder. People who do rocket science think that neurosurgery must be harder. People who do neurosurgery think that rocket science must be harder. And the reason for all of this is because people go into fields that they're maybe not necessarily like, or that are easy for them. I don't think rocket science is necessarily easy for anyone. Brain surgery does not come naturally to people. But for example, I became a behavioral neuroscientist, and my whole joke is that I don't understand math. I don't get physics. That's why I do behavioral neuroscience. Is it easy by any means? No. Does it make a lot more sense to me than physics? Yes. But if you reverse that and you asked a physicist if they thought that neuroscience made sense, I guarantee they would say no.
Well, that's an easy one to answer. Brain surgery is harder. Consider that there are 100 billion neurons.
No! Okay. It hurts my heart a little bit to admit, but neuroscientists and neurosurgeons do tend to have a bit of a god complex. Again, no hate to this dude. He's just a guy that the internet chose to answer these questions. And all brain surgeons that I've ever interacted with are like this. But I think we should be giving more credit to people in other fields. Like, you became a brain surgeon. I guarantee if they had you do rocket science, like, you would not be able to do it. I don't know. Just because you're in a field does not make that field superior.
That there are 100 billion neurons in the brain. The amount of connections between those 100 billion neurons are greater than all of the stars estimated in the universe. That's why it's harder.
Okay, but you're acting like physicists have to do surgery in between all of the stars. These are two extremely different fields. You can't compare them like that. Honestly, I thought he was going to go the route of like you have a living person in brain surgery and you don't in rocket science. And on that note, I would say that like that just adds pressure. It doesn't necessarily make it more difficult. But no, like physicists are doing and rocket scientists are doing a completely different thing to neuroscientists. You can't just say that there are more neurons than there are stars.
Lightning Anthony asks, do brain surgeons practice on fake rubber brains before having a crack at the real thing? No. We learn on the job.
No, you don't.
The very first time I walked into an operating room, I was struck by the smell. We use electric cautery, that is electricity, in order to control bleeding in the brain.
Yeah, that does smell really bad. I have been in an operating theater where they were cauterizing, which is like when they really burn the skin to prevent bleeding, and it does not smell good. Also, brains don't smell good, but brains don't smell strong enough for you to smell them unless you're smelling them on purpose, so it's not that much of a concern. But there's no way that neurosurgeons learn on the job. They definitely practice brain surgery. I do brain surgery on rats, and I did not learn on a living rat. Like, it's concerning if I had more training prior to doing brain surgery than a brain surgeon did.
In essence, what you're doing is cooking flesh. And well, human beings have a very particular smell when they are being cooked. That is a pretty eye-opening or nose-opening experience the first time you go into an operating room. It would be very hard to replicate it. Even the best simulation technology isn't quite the same, at least currently, than the operating room itself.
Oh my God. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to turn into a hate watch. I genuinely thought that this would be a fun experience, but this man's making me very angry. Hi, Editing Morgan here. So I was working on editing this video and I went to check out the comments on the original like Wired interview video because I was wondering like what other people might be taking away from this, and I noticed that quite a few people were saying that there was like really poor editing happening, and that might be part of the reason why a lot of this neurosurgeon's answers don't really fit the question that's being asked, or that like they don't really make sense. So I just want to say, I know I'm sort of like getting really upset with this neurosurgeon, but part of it might be due to the editing. Who knows? But I just did want to like come in real fast and mention that. So like he says right there, they have simulators. They do have things that they do prior to going to the operating room. Yes, obviously nothing that you practice on is going to be the exact same environment as your first real patient, obviously, but it's important to note that you did have some practice first. You're not just some guy walking in off the street who is now going to stab into someone's brain. Like, there's a huge distinction there. Any amount of practice is better than that awful scenario. It's weird how he made it about smell.
At Ellie V asks, just watched a resection of a brain tumor. Bro, how do neurosurgeons do it? And it was done perfectly. The skill must be crazy. Nature has inconveniently placed the brain inside a box called your skull. And trying to get into that skull is like pulling off a heist. You have to get into the brain, not cause any damage, remove the tumor, and get out, leaving the patient no worse than you found them. Depending on the tumor, it can look very, very similar to normal and healthy brain, and it takes an experienced eye and some new technologies for us to see in the operating room where tumor ends and where normal brain begins.
See, the thing that he's not saying here is, like, I'm not discounting how much skill neurosurgery takes. Obviously, it takes a lot of skill, a lot of precision, very fine motor movements. I think they do a lot of simulations that involve, like, just being able to go very, like, steadily and, like, keep your hands steady, because if you just, like, twitch a little bit, then you're going to stab something really important. Obviously, brain surgery takes a lot of skill. But I think part of what he's leaving out here is that, like, they have, like, microscopes and stuff. And also they're doing all of this through, like, a robotic arm that is, like, much smaller and does much more like fine movements than a human hand could do. They have tools that are assisting them. Don't let any surgeon convince you that they are a god for doing what they are doing. They provide an extremely important service to people, and they go through a lot of training, and that's all very important. I just think a lot of surgeons, especially neurosurgeons, need to be knocked down a few pegs.
Sometimes, because the tumor is particularly soft, we would take it out piecemeal by suction. A suction is essentially a metal instrument that's a straw that also has ultrasonic energy.
The average person is
to
so
its
dumb.
tip
If I told you that we use suction to pull
along.
something out,
Once all the bleeding is stopped, we essentially then close the covering on the brain, which is called the dura, fix the bone flap back to the skull, then we close the scalp, then we get lunch. At Lydia Bohea asks, what happens if you need to sneeze during awake brain surgery? Or do they give you something so you don't sneeze?
I love this question. I don't know what his answer is going to be because, again, I'm not a neurosurgeon. But what I would imagine is they do have your head extremely fixed very steadily. Like, they have a lot, like you've seen on movies, the thing that goes around the head. They have a lot of stuff that goes into making sure that you can't move your head at all. Because, like he said earlier, even when your heart beats or when you breathe, your whole body moves when you do that. And because we're used to being alive, we don't really notice it that much. But even like if you take a breath in, your head moves up and down. Like, so they have your head pretty fixed. I think even if you sneezed, you wouldn't be able to like move like how you sneeze when you like move when you sneeze.
Sneezing is often accompanied by something called a Valsalva maneuver, where the pressure inside the brain temporarily spikes and then goes down again. I do deep brain stimulation.
I'm a firm believer that all scientists need some science communication practice. It's not something that we're trained in, but this man very clearly is trying to do good science communication, but he's not succeeding. And like, imagine if you were a patient, how confusing all of this would be to you.
And there's a relatively small hole that's made in the skull, about the size of a dime. Sometimes when a patient sneezes or coughs, you can actually see the brain pulsate up a little bit. That can potentially be a problem, but it's pretty rare. At Will Meehan asks, how do they fill the hole in your skull after brain surgery?
Ooh. Okay, again, I don't know what he's gonna say because I don't do this on humans, but I was in a lab once where we, again, like did brain surgery on rats. Don't worry, they were all asleep. It was all done very ethically. They got like the same level of pain management that a human would receive. It's fine. But because the hole was so small, it was so teeny tiny, there was no like preserving the bit of skull that you got out of it. So what we did to fill it is they make special stuff. It's like putty. I want to say it's called like bone putty or bone cement or something. It's specifically made for this purpose, and it's made to mimic bone. And it basically like you knead it and it works like a putty, and you sort of like fill in the hole with it, and then it'll like cure and harden and become like bone. It's pretty neat. Like the things that science has come up with, super cool. I hope he says they use that too.
The most common way that we fill that hole is with the patient's own skull. We usually affix that piece of skull, called a bone flap, back to the rest of the skull with titanium mini plates. Sometimes we have to remove a piece of skull permanently. Very often this can be in the setting of trauma. We used to do this with titanium mesh, so we would get essentially like a screen door, bend it into place, and affix it to the rest of the skull.
I hate the way he
cover
describes
the hole.
anything.
More recently, we can get a CAT scan of a patient, and computers can design a perfect plastic replacement for what we removed that looks just about as good as the real thing. At Darkwise asks, why do most brain tumors trigger food smells? Are brain tumors delicious? Sometimes tumors can...
So, I don't know the full answer to this. I hope he talks about it. But something that I think is really interesting is that your sense of smell, the way that we process it, to carry that information to the places that it needs to go, some neurons travel through your brain regions that are associated with memory. And so that's part of the reason why smell is so closely associated with memory, is because they're more tightly linked than the other sensations, because those nerves have to like go through it. So that's neat. I don't know. That's all I could think of.
And create seizures in the brain, and depending on where the seizures arise from, can involve smell-associated or olfaction-associated areas of the brain. Very often these smells are actually bad smells, so it is very, very unusual to elicit a hallucination that is a good smell, but it can happen. At Kazu,
he didn't explain it at all. Like, just he's not explaining anything. But yeah, like the most common one is like if you're having like a stroke, you might smell like burnt toast. So like he's right that it's normally like, I don't know, I don't think burnt toast is the worst smell in the world, but it's not normally like a pleasant smell. But he didn't explain why it happens.
Dingus asks, if I was doing brain surgery, I would swirl my finger through the guy's brain just to see what happens. Dear Lord, really? Running a finger.
Fun fact. That's how they used to do mummification. Not with a finger, they had like a little stick that they would just sort of like make some soup in your skull with. So there were people in the past who did that. And like I was talking earlier, I've squished a few pieces of brain for science reasons. And it is very fun. I don't blame people for having the urge, and I imagine something you'd have to suppress a lot as a neurosurgeon.
Over the surface of the brain, if you're very, very gentle, will do very little.
So cool.
If there is pathology near the surface, the brain surface can be friable, where just the merest touch can cause bleeding, but a healthy brain can be touched with very little recourse.
See, this is the nice thing about being a neuroscientist versus a neurosurgeon, is as a neuroscientist, I only really interact with dead brains, so I don't really have to worry about the repercussions of if I touch the surface, what would happen to the person. I can just do it. So if you're trying to decide between being a neuroscientist or a neurosurgeon, there's one big distinction.
Ed Zeldovitz Lauren asks, why were lobotomies ever a thing? Lobotomy.
So here's a fun fact about me. Okay, side note, I made a video on the history of lobotomies at one point. I will link it up in the description. It's at very early days of my channel, so please don't judge me. But whenever I was younger, the thing that initially got me interested in neuroscience was that a lot of members of my family, including myself, suffer from various mental illnesses. And as an 11-year-old, I independently came up with the idea of lobotomies. I was like, what if there was a brain region that we could just remove and then mental illness would be cured? And that was my initial spark in my love of neuroscience. And then I learned about lobotomies, and then I was like, oh, so it's bad if you do that. But it took us a long time to figure that out. Or not. People were screaming at doctors and researchers for a long time, telling us that it was bad. But it took the medical establishment a long time to listen to people saying that lobotomies were bad. Because lobotomies, the one thing that lobotomies did do extremely well was essentially create like living zombies, where people would have like no emotions, no feelings. They oftentimes wouldn't be able to talk or really interact with people. So let's say you go from having like a very disobedient wife, you take her in to get a lobotomy, and now she's just the most nothing person. You might see that as a good thing because you're a man in the 1950s or something. So yeah, it took a while for people to listen, but the initial thought behind them was there must be some part of the brain that is causing this. Like we talk about with like tumors, or I don't know, the main example is tumors. If you see a tumor, you can take it out, problem's gone. If there's a part of the brain that causes mental illness and you can take it out and the problem's gone, that would be great. Unfortunately for us, that's not how mental illness works. It's much more complicated, and that's why we're still struggling to treat it today.
These were not only a thing, they are the only instance where neurosurgery ever won the Nobel Prize. In the early days of the 20th century, psychiatric care was extremely rudimentary. There were many, many, many patients institutionalized. It was a huge burden for families.
This is also a good point. If you listen to podcasts, I really like the podcast Sawbones, And they've talked about a lot of different things that we used to think were medicine that are not medicine or are not good medicine. And one of the big themes throughout the history of how we've treated medicine and how we've treated human beings is, for a lot of history, we didn't have medical treatments that actually did anything. We weren't able to actually cure diseases. We could just alleviate symptoms, or we could just like do our best to help people, but it wouldn't really do much. So a lot of times if something did anything, we would go, that's medicine. That's good medicine because it did something where we have nothing. So if you think about how much we're still struggling to treat mental illness today, back then, lobotomies did something, and so they could point to it and say, look, we did something. Used to, we couldn't do anything, now we've done something. Which I'm not saying is valid or good, but that was part of the logic behind it too, that they didn't really have a great way to treat mental illness, and so they were like, well, we could do nothing or we could do something, so we did something. The something wasn't great, and it actually made them like less of a person, but it was something. So that's that. It's a very heavy topic, very difficult to answer in a wired interview.
John Fulton, a physiologist at Yale, discovered that the frontal lobe was really important in creating the manifestations that we associate with psychiatric disease. Egaz Monet speculated that if we were to interrupt certain fibers inside that frontal lobe, that we could in fact help patients. An instrument called a leucotome is inserted into the brain, and then a hole was made inside the deep portions of the frontal lobe. Once Thorazine was invented, the use of lobotomy as a treatment for psychiatric disease fell out of favor, but the whole process actually helped mankind really truly understand the physiology of psychiatric disease for the very first time. That psychiatric disease was not a weakness in a patient's soul, but a real disease like diabetes, and actually led to a lot of understanding and treatment that we are using today. At Dibs on Debs asked,
he's not wrong. That was like one of the first times that we looked at mental illness and thought, oh, maybe this is a real medical issue and not like demons in someone's head. But I still think it's very important, the language that we use to talk about this, and that we still point out it was bad. And another big thing that still happens sometimes with mental illness is that it very much upheld the system of looking more at the burden that mental illness causes other people than talking to the individual with the mental illness. Because like I said, people would take in their loved ones to a psychiatric facility, or loved ones, they express their love in an interesting way, but they took their loved ones into a psychiatric facility, went, hey, will you do a lobotomy because my wife is depressed and she won't talk to me, or like she's mad at me because I don't understand her depression. And then they would do a lobotomy, and then she just wouldn't be able to say anything or think for herself or really do much, and she would just become like a shell of a human being, and they would be like, cool, she's not mad at me anymore, problem fixed, I have a submissive wife now. Like that was really the attitude. So yeah, still not great. Hi there, Editing Morgan popping in again. Can you believe that it took me over a full week to edit this video? So without editing, the video was close to 2 hours long, and with editing, it wound up being like 56 minutes. So I'm gonna split this into a two-parter. I'm posting both parts at the same time, and you can click on the second part. It'll be somewhere around here. In my personal opinion, I think the second part is a little bit better. We get into like some more spicy stuff of like me disagreeing with this neurosurgeon on some issues. So I recommend checking it out, but obviously that's up to you.